Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to another Adobe XD Masterclass. My name is Howard Pinsky, Senior XD Evangelist here at Adobe. Hope you're all doing well on this Friday afternoon, and I hope you're all excited for the 100th Masterclass. I tried to get some confetti overlays, couldn't make it happen in time, but yay! That's all I got. But if you are tuning in live here on Behance today, let me know in the chat who you are and where you're tuning in from. We've got Mwenda and Jack, who just wrapped up the Illustrator Daily Challenge. And we've got Wade and Philip and Misha and Nabil, who's saying he's very excited today. I am too. Laura and Eric and Katarina, great to see all of you. Hope you're excited. Masterclass number 100. I feel like we've been hyping this up for quite some time, and hopefully it lives up to that hype. We're going to be starting a brand new project today. I was hoping to get into some VR and AR stuff, but I recently got Meta Quest 2, I think it was, and gosh, that thing is wild. VR, this is my first experience with VR. Absolutely wild. I'm going to take a little bit more time to really dive in and study it before I start designing for it. But man, the future is going to be weird. All right, let's go ahead and hop over to my screen. And we've got Misty, who says, Wahoo 100, and Cheryl from Florida. Awesome to see all of you. New faces and familiar faces. All right, here's what we're going to be working on today. If you've been following me over the last month, you might have noticed that I've been releasing daily files on Dribbble and Behance, mostly on Dribbble, but I've been releasing a few of them on Behance as well. This is going to be one of them that I'll be releasing towards the end of the month, probably in a few days, possibly. And it's a music application. This is the home screen for a music app. And I want to start designing this live because this will expand into something much larger. When I do release this, it might just be the home page, but eventually it'll be many of these pages, including wired up elements, components, all sorts of fun stuff. And if you do want to dive into the files that I've been releasing, dribbble.com/Pinsky, and Wade just linked my Twitter. You can find some of that stuff as well over there. Here's an example of, a few examples of what I've been releasing. Yesterday, I released a sign-up form. Very simple, right? But it's all wired up. I use a lottie animation right here for the text cursor, right? And then we have something like a Winamp skin. Might not be very useful, but it's kind of fun. Then you have some more useful things like an animated upload button and some camera experiences, a lot of different things. We're up to freebie number 20 for the month. It's going pretty well. And I'll have some bigger ones towards the end of the month, including that music application. All right, so we're gonna get going with the music app, and I'm gonna hop over to Adobe XD, and where did it go? Here it is. Switch it on over to this screen. And if anyone has questions throughout this masterclass, definitely throw them in the chat. And Vasco is saying, first time live after so many masterclasses from Portugal. Great to see you, Vasco, and thanks for tuning in. All right. Hey, Megan, great to see you as well. Hopefully hockey season will start up soon enough so we can be rivals again. Always a fun time. All right, so we're going to get going, and we're going to start off with, let's go nice and large, right? We've got web 1920 by 1080. We can, of course, do 1366, 1280, completely up to you what you're designing for. Of course, if you're designing for a tablet or some sort of a mobile device, I guess tablet is a mobile device as well, you can kind of adapt it to that. So I'm going to go ahead and 1920 by 1080. I'm going to make this nice and large, and we've got our first artboard to start off. Now, typically during these masterclasses, I'll dive straight into the high fidelity work because time is limited, but I might span this particular design over 2 or 3 masterclasses as we dive deeper. So what I want to focus on now is what many designers start out doing. And some of them start out, on a napkin, sketchbook, or sometimes just in an application like XD. And really, it's about blocking out where elements are going to go. And this is so incredibly important to figuring out the user interface and the user experience in many cases. It just kind of helps wrap your mind around what it's going to look like. And I would also encourage you to go to something like Behance, right? And you can search a keyword like music, and music is going to pop up, and then you can really start dialing in what the creative field is. So UI and UX, right? And you'll start to be able to really dive into these and get some inspiration. And I've talked a lot about inspiration before. It's not about copying, it's about finding things that work in various projects like this, right? This is a beautiful case study, by the way. Definitely go check this one out. But it's about finding things that work in all these different projects and real-world applications like Spotify and Apple Music and Tidal and all these different music apps in this particular case, and bringing them all together in a new experience. So definitely, I would encourage you to do that. All right, we're gonna start blocking things out, and as you know, rectangles probably the best thing to use in terms of blocking things out. So shortcut key R, and we're gonna start with the sidebar on the left-hand side. And I'm thinking, there are a few ways to design a sidebar for an application like this. You can have Becca saying, oh my God, those unread messages. Oh, you're probably referring to this up here. Yeah, on Behance, I just get so many, I think this is like, the last time I checked, it was like 40,000 or something notifications, something bonkers like that. There's a lot of them. All right, so a sidebar, I did release a sidebar on Dribbble, by the way, but you can design an expanded sidebar where you can see all the information at once, including the labels, or you can design a sidebar that's a little bit more collapsed where it basically shows just the icons. And I think for this particular case, at least at the beginning, we're gonna start off with an expanded sidebar, right? And then towards the bottom, one of the most important elements of a music application is the actual play bar, right? So we'll have something like this, and this is where your album is going to be displayed, your play buttons, advanced, back, and then possibly sound bars or volume controls, all sorts of different things, right? So we're gonna have that right about down here. And then we have, this is the home screen. So we're gonna have a lot of content in the center. And depending on how you want your application to be displayed, whether it's full width or a little bit collapsed, you can definitely adjust the artboard a little bit. So if you don't want to work 1920, sometimes you want a little bit squishy. Squishy, is that a proper design term? I don't know. It's going to be now squishy, right? But with responsive resize, we'll be able to very easily resize some of this stuff. Now at the top of our home screen, we're probably going to want the ability to search. One thing that I do all the time when I'm opening up Spotify or Apple Music is searching for songs that I recently heard or want to listen to, right? So right at the top, we might want a search bar. And we're going to leave it somewhere right about here for now. And if we are working with an 8-pixel grid, we'll probably want, let's say, 32 from the top and probably about 32, about the same from the left-hand side of this, or I guess the right-hand side of the sidebar. And in order to show those measurements, hold down your Alt or Option key and then hover, and you'll be able to see those just like that, right? Now, at this point in a project, you may not necessarily want to worry too much about things like rounded corners, corner radiuses, right? But just to kind of give you an idea of what we're going to be going for, very subtle. We probably don't want something like this. It looks a little bit awkward. Sometimes, depending on the style, you can go full, almost like capsule pill-shaped. But I think we're going to go nice and subtle, somewhere around 8 pixels. I think 4 might be a little bit too little. So I think 8 should work quite nicely. I'm going to bring this up a little bit. And then over to the right-hand side, we may want some very basic navigation links. Things like your profile and then maybe notification, right? So if I grab, let's say, an ellipse, I can go ahead and draw one out. And this will be for our profile. And maybe we'll do about 48 from the right. And then we'll probably want the person's name over here. I'm not too worried right at the moment about typefaces. We're going to get into that in a little bit, but for all intents of Comic Sans, right? Yeah. Okay, probably not. And then we'll probably want something like a notification bell over here. Now, I don't know exactly why you'd need notifications on a music app. Maybe, if your friends are on there, you can add friends, you can get notifications from them. Who knows? Lots of different reasons. But we're going to go ahead and do something like that, and we're just going to have a placeholder for now. There we go. Beautiful. Well, not completely beautiful, but functional. Hopefully. We'll see. Now, right down below this information, we're going to want to kick off this screen with maybe like a featured section, right? You might have either a carousel or just one large block that highlights maybe a latest album, a latest song, or something that's part of your collection that maybe you listen to on a daily basis, right? So once again, with the rectangle, we're going to draw one out across this artboard. Now, one thing I'm noticing is, on over here to the right, I have about 48 from the right, but over here, I have 32. So we might want to make this consistent just by kind of bumping this over to about 48. And we can probably keep the top padding about 32. That should look okay. All right, so we've got our block, and we're going to make it also consistent by rounding out the corners about 8 pixels as well. And then in terms of the size of this element, I'm not too concerned at the moment of how tall it is, right? Because once we start using stacks to our advantage, we'll be able to very easily, manipulate that, and then everything below it is going to adjust beautifully. So I'll leave it somewhere in this range here. Although right now the height is set to 313. It's not a great number. 312 is a little bit better. Make things nice and even. Megan is saying, Howard's Dribble is how I'm learning design for dark mode. Great resource. That's an interesting, I think we're going to get into that conversation maybe next week or the week after. And I've spoken a little bit about designing for dark mode, and it's not as easy as you might think. It's not just about, choosing black instead of white. There's a lot that goes into it, including shifting your colors ever so slightly to remove some saturation so that it doesn't, there's not like some muddiness or, blaring issues. It's a fine-tuned topic. It's very interesting. I like it a lot, but we'll definitely get into it. All right, so we have our featured section right up here. Maybe I'll increase this a little bit more. And then right down below, we may want, some album views, and this could be maybe 4 of them going across. So I can duplicate this downwards a little bit. And what I'll want to do is I'll want to make sure that I can easily fit 4 albums going across this particular container, right? So if I have this object selected, excuse me, inside of my properties inspector, we can do some basic math. So right now the width is set to 1310. I can divide that by 4, so /4, right? And that'll ensure that 4 of these albums fit perfectly across, which we don't want it to fit perfectly because then there'll be no padding. So what we can do is we can maybe -8, for example, right? And maybe we can even this out. Maybe let's go like 320. So that way, when we do get to the point where we're going to be using a repeat grid or a stack, right? We can very easily, there we go. And it looks pretty good. Now, of course, if you wanted more space or less space, you would change that value where I -8, right? And you can do something like -16. There we go. Maybe I'll round it down to 310. And then the same thing. So now we'll have basically the same thing with a little bit more space, which I think looks a little bit better. A little bit more breathing room never hurts, right? Let's go ahead and undo this, because what I want to do is add some additional information into this particular album. I'm going to make this a little bit larger. And then right down below, we might want 2 main pieces of information. We might want the album name and then possibly the artist. So right down below, I'm going to click and then just type out Comic Sans is forever haunting, isn't it? I guess for now, I'll just switch back to Helvetica. And we'll just bump this up to bold. And in terms of the size, that might be a little bit too large. Right now it's set to 20. It doesn't look too bad, but we have to keep in mind with things like this that there might be some album names that are a lot longer. And of course, we can get into the whole conversation of truncation, right? But I think we're probably just going to drop the size a little bit to make sure that most album names, will fit really nicely, right? And then down below, artist name. Now this one is usually secondary information, so I'm going to drop the weight to medium, and possibly, in some cases, you might want to drop the size as well. We'll see what that looks like. But the nice thing is we're going to be using a repeat grid in this case. So we can easily make that change and it's going to populate to all the different repeat grid cells, right? And let me show you how that works. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select all this information here. So we have the album cover, and we have our album name and artist name, and we're going to place these into a repeat grid. Command and Control R. Boop. It didn't work. My button did not work for the repeat grid overlay. It was there, I promise. All right, and once we have that done, just like I showed you before, we can drag out additional cells just like this and increase the spacing, and that looks pretty good. And what I was saying earlier is if we decide to make some changes to maybe the size or basically anything, right? It's gonna push those changes across all the different cells, and you're gonna see this more in action in a little bit. Now we also might want a title, but we're gonna get to that in just a moment. Now on the next line, we may wanna break it up and have maybe another featured section, right? Or anothered? Did I say anothered? We might want another featured section, and this might be possibly 2 albums going across, right? So we can bring that back and then minus 16. And that way we can have, there we go. Although what you might want to do is make sure that lines up with this album here. So this is where guides can really come into play. Also, a grid system can work as well. But I'm going to drag out a guide right up to about there, and then to about here, right? And I can just make sure that these snap really nicely. Ooh. There we go. And I'm going to place both these into a group, Command and Control G, and make sure that this is named Feature. And I'm also going to turn a stack on for this particular group. And this will allow me, let me go ahead and change the color of one of these. This will allow me to very easily dive in to this group and just swap the position of these objects if I needed to, right? And speaking of stacks, what we might want to do at this point, now that we have a nice amount of information in this section, is group all of it and then turn a stack on. And that will really allow us to rearrange some of this content easily and also add new content as we need to. So I'm going to select this group, the repeat grid, and then this featured section right here at the top. I'm not too concerned about this section up here because that's always going to stay at the top. So I don't really need that inside of a stack. So I'm going to group this information. I'm going to call this content. And then within the properties inspector, I'm going to turn a stack on. Now, when I turn this on, by default, stacks assign a horizontal. It becomes a horizontal stack, essentially. But because there are multiple objects inside of this group, there's a repeat grid, there's another group, there's some elements, it noticed the direction that those elements are going, so it defined it as a vertical stack. And now I can dive in and adjust the spacing as I need to, right over here. So I can do 32 pixels in between each, or 40, whatever works for your grid system. But most of all, when I want to dive in here and add some additional content, let's say I wanted to add a header, I can just dive in just for you, right? It automatically moves things down as you would expect, right? And I can adjust the spacing on an individual basis if I need to, right? There we go. Does this line up? It doesn't look like it lined. Let's make sure that things are lined. It does not. I should probably, this is the low fidelity, but still, I kind of want to make sure everything lines up as nicely as possible. I'm just going to dive in here and make some very quick changes. That looks pretty good. This side can be brought in a little bit more. That should work. All right, Martin is asking when is something a repeat grid versus a component, or components for animation handling states? That's an interesting question. So repeat grids and components share some very similar functionality in that you can dive into, in this case, the repeat grid, you can dive into any of them, make some changes, let's say the color, right? And it's going to propagate those changes to all the other cells. And a main component does something very similar, right? Where if you dive into the main component, you can make some changes and kind of push those changes to all the instances of that component that were not overridden. The benefit of using components, this is why I like using components and stacks together, is that you can dive into an instance of a component and you can make an override. So if I wanted to, in this repeat grid, if I want to change just the color of this album name, I can't, because by design, a repeat grid keeps all the cells up to date, right? But on a component, I can dive into an instance and make an individual change and not have it pushed to all the others, as long as I don't edit the main component, right? Also on components, you can have different states as well. So you can have, if you're working on a button, which we're definitely going to get to possibly soon, you can have a button that's like a primary button, and then you can have a state that's a secondary, an outline button, an inactive, an error state, all sorts of different things, and then switch between those very easily. And you're going to see more of that in action shortly. All right, I'm going to make sure to move this play bar towards the top. I'm going to name some of these layers just so that I keep things nice and organized. Sidebar, and this up here is our search. And then we've got our profile, and then notification. Did I spell that right? I didn't. Notifications. All right. And then finally, I'm going to dive in here and duplicate this down. I'm going to call this, just give another name to the section down here at the bottom. And just like that, we have more or less completed our kind of low fidelity design of this music application, right? Now, of course, there's a lot more that we can add on to this, and we're going to add on to this, but this should give you kind of an idea of where the content is going to go. And if you're working with a client or you're working with a team, this is a great opportunity to kind of pass this along or even invite them to co-edit this document so that they can take a look, give feedback. If you're working with users, definitely get this in the hands of users and ask them, if you were to open this application and take a look at this, would this make sense? Would you know where to tap? Would you know what to do? Now, we might want to add some more information so that users can get a little bit more context. But for the most part, I think we're kind of going in the right direction, right? Now, one thing we might want to start blocking out is maybe more of the featured section. So right here at the top, what I'm thinking is we might want to display maybe one new album, right? And include a nice large image of maybe the artist. So because we're in a stack, watch what's going to happen if I grab my text tool and click. Right? Hello. Things jumped all over the place. And it actually did exactly what it was supposed to do, right? When I'm inside of a stack that's defined vertically and I add a new object, it's going to push the other objects down based on where I started creating the newest object. But of course, in this case, that's not exactly what we want. We want to add some text over top of this featured section, right? So in that case, what we'll want to do is place this featured rectangle into a group, Command and Control G. I'll call this featured. And then inside of the group, we can now create additional objects like text, right? So when you have a bunch of objects into a group, the stack looks at that as a single object. So it's not going to start moving things around. So definitely keep that in mind, right? So this might be, let's say this is soothing tune, right? So we'll just start with the word soothing, and we'll make this nice and large. And we'll place it somewhere around there. Again, this is our low fidelity design, so we're not too concerned about the typefaces, but we are going to get a little bit fancy with this typeface once the time comes. And then down below, we might want tunes. Maybe that'll be a little bit smaller, right? Something like that. And then down below, we might want a play button. And then we'll want listen now. Definitely want to make that quite a bit smaller. And right about here, right? So we definitely want a nice, clear call to action so that if a user lands on this page and they see something interesting in this top section, they should know exactly what to do. Nice large play button, some text that says listen now. So we'll start with that, right? And then over to the right, we may want a few additional things. One, we're going to want our image of our artist. So we'll place it right about here for now. And then over to the right-hand side, every platform is getting very social these days. So we might want a very quick call out of, how many users follow this particular artist. So like we did at the top, we might want a very quick profile photo. And then it's very large. Definitely don't want it that large. Something like that, right? That could work. And I'll place it somewhere right about here. All right. Again, not very beautiful, but definitely something that, you have to go through as a designer. Blocking things out, making sure things make sense, and it's sometimes a little bit difficult to look at, but it's definitely going to help as you're designing, making sure everything's in the right place at the right time, right? Move some of this information up and center it a little bit. Maybe I'll move it over. There we go. And then in terms of the sidebar, this is kind of where you might want to start thinking about your branding, because right at the top of your sidebar, you're probably going to want a logo, right? Right about here. You're going to want some sort of a logo. Now, of course, it depends if your sidebar is expanded or collapsed. Now, this is the expanded state. So the logo at the top is going to be the entire logo. And in a collapsed state, you might just see maybe a simple logo or a letter of some sort, right? Now, in this case, we might want to bring in the Boop branding. And what a lot of designers like to do is they'll have a separate artboard where they will work on their branding and their design system, colors, all sorts of different things. Now, I do have over in my CC libraries, I have Boop branding. So I have a few different logos, right? I have the B, I have the Boop long, and then I have Boop short. I'm going to go ahead and drag out the Boop long, which is very long and large right now, but I want to make sure to change the color so we can see it. Something like that. And then because we're focused on more of a music application, we might want to add in some additional context for that. Of course, the application could just be called Boop, but it may also be called something like Boop Beats, right? And something like this isn't terrible. Of course, I probably wouldn't go for Helvetica, right? But, very simple, clean typeface isn't bad, but in some cases you might want to get a little bit more stylistic with your typefaces. Got to be careful though. You don't want to get too stylistic, but something like ice cream could work. And then I can maybe apply, if we started to explore what our primary colors are, right? We might want to start applying those colors. So in this case, it might be this nice blurple. I love using blurple. It's just a wonderful word. It's a wonderful, look at that color. It's just a beautiful color. It's not a blue, it's not a purple, it's like a blurple. And it sounds like something that your body does after you've eaten too much Chipotle. You just blurple a little bit. I don't know why I am the way I am. But anyways, so we have our logo, Boop Beats, right? And that looks pretty good. Now, what you might have noticed is when I brought this logo in from my Creative Cloud libraries, it came in with a link, right? This little guy up here, right? How close can I get to this? There it is. And that indicates that this logo is linked back to its source document, right? So if I were to make a change to that logo at any point in the future, I can easily update that logo. Wade and Megan are laughing at my terrible blurple joke. I can make the change and I can push that change to this document. Now, if you don't need to worry about that, you can right click and then unlink the component, just like that. And I can also make this into a component as well if I want to make sure that if I'm using this across multiple artboards, which I'm definitely going to do, I can very easily make a change on this document in the main component, like we were talking about earlier. I'm going to push that change everywhere else. So Command and Control K to create a component. Nope, my little short, let me see if I click on it. There it is. Look at that over there. Fancy. Command and Control K, and you can create a component, and I'll call this logo, right? So now I can very easily move over here and paste it. Definitely it's way too large, so I'm gonna make sure it's nice and small. Now, I do have responsive resize on, so I'm gonna turn responsive resize off on the main component. And now I can shrink this down and make sure that it fits nicely and lines up perfectly, right? Let's get some more guides going. I think that sidebar looks a little bit too large. But I mean, this is the low fidelity design, so we can definitely make some changes to that at some point in the future. But looking pretty good. All right. Now, before we get more into the sidebar, because we did cover a sidebar, I think it was last masterclass, let's start working on getting some typefaces into the mix and also maybe designing out this featured section. So I'm going to make sure to duplicate this artboard just so that I have my low fidelity design kind of saved over here to the left. And then I can start kind of blocking out what the higher fidelity design looks like. Now, in terms of the color of this featured section in the background, let me delete this for now. We might want to start off with maybe a nice soothing gradient because we are working on soothing tunes, right? That album. So I'm going to hop over in my color picker. I'm going to switch over to maybe a linear gradient, and then possibly from the top left-hand corner, maybe to the bottom right-hand corner, we might want to define our gradient. And we want to make sure that our gradient is nice and subtle. So we might want something like, actually, let me do the blue in the top left-hand corner. Something like that. And then the bottom right-hand corner, we might want to do basically the same color, but adding a little bit of purple to it, right? I'm going to bring out some of the color like that. Something along those lines. Again, you want to make sure your gradients are relatively subtle. Now, because we're working with a larger and elongated rectangle, we have a little bit more flexibility, right? If I were to shrink this, I mean, it still doesn't look too bad, but if you're working with a smaller object, you don't have as much room for that gradient to blend, right? So I think something like this could potentially work, and we're going to add a texture on top of it. So it might help blend it in a little bit more. And then in terms of the color of the text, I think the black is probably not going to work on the blue and the purple, right? So we're going to probably want to switch these text layers, this one down here, over to white. And we'll definitely want to, check our contrast, talk to users to make sure that things are looking okay. I would probably argue we'll likely have to shift the blue a little bit, add a little bit more contrast. There we go. And typeface wise, again, Helvetica, not a terrible typeface. Probably want to switch it up, especially for this section here. And because we're dealing with a much larger text layer, we can get away with more of a display typeface. So something like Blenny is kind of fun, right? And that's a typeface you can find over on Adobe Fonts. So if you go to fonts.adobe.com, you go to all fonts, or if you know the typeface that you're looking for, you can very easily just search it, right? So something like Blenny will appear, right? There it is. There's Blenny. And what's kind of cool is if you dive into these typefaces and you scroll down a little bit, it's going to show you fonts that look like Blenny. Oh no, Blazeface is also a very fun display typeface. Very difficult to use in many situations, but when you do find that perfect moment to use a typeface like Oh no, Blazeface, it's just magical, right? But you can also go to the all fonts section and you have this whole section over here to the left where you can kind of filter by tag. So if you want more of a funky typeface, and you can type out something like soothing, right? Now, of course, a lot of these are just not going to work for what we're working on, but some of them might, right? We can try something like luxury. And we have some interesting, this one's kind of cool too, courage, right? And some of them have different weights as well. Some of the display typefaces are more or less, the way they are, but this one has regular and italic. Some of these are kind of fun. I can spend hours just looking at typefaces. But anyways, let's go back to XD, and I'm also going to change this one down here. There we go. So we have soothing tunes. I might want to make this a little bit smaller, or I can make this one a little bit larger. Once we get our featured image in, then we'll really be able to dial this in and make sure that the text is nice and readable, right? Now, down here, we have our play button. In this case, we definitely do not want to use blending. Now, when I'm zoomed in like this, it looks okay, right? It's readable. I can see it says listen now, but when I preview, right? Many of us might be able to look at this and say, okay, well, that says listen now. It's fine, right? But a lot of people probably would not. So what we might want to do for more of a smaller text layer is really dial that back and switch to something a little bit more traditional, right? So something like Forma, which I've been using quite a bit lately. And that's also an Adobe font. It's on Adobe fonts, right? Forma. There we go. So there's a lot of different Forma text or typefaces, right? This one is Forma DJR text. I don't know what DJR means, but it's very simple, right? It's nice. It works. And I probably don't want the black weight. I'm going to probably bump this down to bold. And if I need to, I can always space out the characters a little bit to make it a little bit more readable. But something like that could work. Maybe I'll bump this down a little bit and then increase the spacing a touch. There we go. All right, we'll get to the play button in just a moment. But what I want to do is really dial in. Let me actually just change this over to white and then medium maybe. That could work. Okay, I want to work on the featured image up here at the top, right? And I'm kind of thinking we have this big open space up here. Now, we could, of course, stretch out the search bar. But that's a lot of space for a search bar. Probably don't need that much space. Oh, wait, it's saying DJR is the designer's initial. That would make sense. So it could be kind of fun, and this may not work in all situations, but it could be kind of fun to have the featured image kind of break out of the bounds of this particular box, right? So I have over here in Finder, I have some images. This one I grabbed from Adobe Stock. Oh, my quick look is not working. But here's the image here, right? And I might want to place this in this section. Now, of course, we could just grab this image and, right, boop, pop it in there. And then move it around, figure all that stuff out, and maybe add some color over to the side. A lot of things we can do. But that won't really help us if we want that image to kind of break out of those bounds, right? So what do? Well, the first thing we're going to have to do is we're going to have to remove this image from the background, right? We could bring it into Photoshop, or what we can also do is bring it into Creative Cloud Express. So if I hop over to Safari, and some of you may not know this, but if you have any sort of subscription with Creative Cloud, you have access to Creative Cloud Express, express.adobe.com. There's also an app for iPhone and Android. But if I hop over to my home page, right down here at the bottom, I have some quick actions to do things like remove backgrounds, resize images, convert to GIF, convert to MP4, which is great if you're bringing videos into XD. So let's go ahead and remove background. And I can just grab this image and boop, pop it in here. It is powered by Photoshop, so it's going to do a great job at removing the background of this image, fixing up the edges a little bit. And then from here, I can go ahead and customize it, or I can download it. So if you're working on like an Instagram story or some sort of a social post or a flyer or whatever it might be using Creative Cloud Express, you can customize it, add some text on top of it, you can go crazy with it. But for now, all I need to do is just download this image. So I don't even have to open up Photoshop. I can just hop over to Creative Cloud Express and do that. Megan's saying the plus button has major Howard gradient vibes. It does, doesn't it? Look at that. That's a fancy plus button. Anyway, so I went ahead and I downloaded this cutout, and now I need to place this into XD. Now, what I don't want to do is do what I did before and just place it into this container, because that's just not going to work, right? Let me undo that. What I want to do is instead place it on top. So if I go into this group, I could copy this and then paste it. However, we're going to get some problems. We're going to run into a problem because we're working inside of a stack. If I were to paste this, oops, wrong document. it's a massive image. So it moved all this content down, and it's kind of just overflowing everywhere. Don't want to do that. But also thinking forward, what we're going to want to do is we're only going to want this image to be kind of exploding out of the bounds on the top and maybe also the right, possibly. So in that case, we're going to want to use an object mask. So with this layer selected at the back, this featured layer, I'm going to duplicate this layer, Command and Control D. And I could go ahead and place this into the mask as well, this featured container. So if I go ahead and select this, right? Would I want to do that? No, you know what? I'm not going to do that. Only because, I mean, I suppose I can put everything into a mask. I suppose I could do that. Thinking things through in your head helps a lot. Of course, there are two ways we can do this. We can either place just the image that we cut out into an object mask, or we can place everything into it. Because most of it's going to be contained, we can probably do that. So I'm going to move this to the top. I'm going to make sure to select all this information down here. And under the object menu, mask with shape, or Command and Control, Shift, and then M, right? And I call this feature. And once that's done, I can now dive in here and paste that image. And because it's inside of that object mask, if I click out of it, right, it did not move the objects down, which is exactly what we want. Now, what we don't want is we don't want this image that large. So we're going to have to dive in here, select this image, and really shrink this down quite a bit. And position it somewhere, maybe right about here, right? Something like that, right? Now, we're noticing a bit of a problem. We want the image to kind of explode outside of this section, but because we have an object mask that was defined with the original shape, it's just masking everything. So in this case, all we have to do is dive in here, grab the object mask, which is the one at the top, which I'll just name mask so we can very easily see what we're working with, and stretch it on out. Now, if we wanted to explode it over to the right-hand side as well, we can just stretch this out as well. So that way, if we select this image, look at that. Fancy, isn't it? But I think I'll leave it probably like that. There we go. All right. And now we can dive in and we can kind of have a little bit more fun with our text layer. So we can maybe increase this a little bit just to add a little bit of overlapping right there. It might not be necessary, but it's kind of fun, right? And there we go. Now, I mentioned earlier, we may also want to introduce a little bit of texture on top of this section here. So what I'm going to do is I have the featured container selected. I want to duplicate that, Command and Control D, just like that. And I'll call this maybe pattern. It's more of a pattern, not a texture. And if I hop back over to Finder, I do have this halftone texture, which I did license from Adobe stock, came over as an Illustrator file. And then what I did was I just imported it into XD, made some changes to the color, and then exported it as a PNG. I'm going to copy it, or I can also drag it directly onto this shape here. And then experiment with our blend mode. So something like overlay could work, or soft light could also work. And I'm going to drop the opacity so it's not too strong. So we just have this nice, subtle texture going on. And I think it looks kind of fun, right? Now, one more thing in this features section we might want to work on is our play button, right? So we have our listen now looking pretty good. And then we have this white container. But on top of that, we might want the actual play button. So I'm going to grab my polygon tool, shortcut key Y, drag one out, rotate it around. I'm holding down my shift key to rotate 15 degrees at a time. I'm going to round the corners ever so slightly, because we are working with rounded corners throughout most of this design, right? And we want to make sure that remains nice and consistent. So I'm going to maybe sample this color in the background. Whoops. There we go. That looks pretty good. That could work. And then what we might want to try, possibly, is maybe introducing a very subtle lottie animation so that this play button can kind of pulse a little bit. So if I hop over to my plugins at the bottom left-hand corner, I do have the Lottie Files plugin installed. And I'll search for something like maybe, oops, why did I type it purple? Pulse. I guess it started with the same name, and I was working with purple earlier. So if I type out Pulse, we've got some interesting elements here. Now, one thing to note about Lottie animations is you cannot edit the color. Even though they are mostly vector-based, there's just no way to edit those colors. So definitely keep that in mind. Adding, this one, it's green. Not going to really work, right? So you'll probably want something like a white pulse, maybe. Let me look up white pulse, see if we find anything interesting. Now, if you've created the animations yourselves in After Effects, that's a whole different story, right? You can definitely dive in here. Now, this one says pulse circle. I'm assuming it's white, possibly. Let's drag it in and take a look. Ooh, that could work. I do have it set to play automatically. That could work, right? So I'm going to make sure to place this right about here. Make sure that it lines up nicely. There we go. And I'm going to place it behind our play button. I'll just place it at the back. And I want to make sure to select all this information here. Group it. Call this play. Now, one thing you definitely want to make sure to do is customize your playback for things like video and Lottie. So over to the right-hand side with this Lottie animation selected, we do have it set to play automatically, which is great. But we also want to make sure that it loops so that this pulse continues to happen as the user is diving into this experience. So this button right over here to the left of that drop-down will allow you to loop that playback. So now if I go ahead and play this, you're going to notice I've got this nice subtle Lottie animation just kind of pulsing in the background. It's not too aggressive. It's not too in your face. It's just kind of there doing its thing, which is wonderful. And you can also potentially look up something like play, right? Or play button, maybe. And you might be able to find some additional Lottie animations that could potentially work for things like this. This one has a pulse on it already, but again, you can't really change the color. So the black play button may not work in this particular case. The orange may not work. Now, there are ways you can use things like blend modes and additional layers to alter the colors and shift them a little bit, but for the most part, just design with the assumption that you cannot change the color of Lottie animations unless you have access to the original. All right, so that's looking pretty good. Now, of course, what we can do over here to the right is add a profile photo of this particular artist, which is this guy over here. Now, I could take this exact image and place that into this little box, or I can bring in images from various other sources. So something like UI faces, for example, will give you access to Unsplash and Pexels, and this person does not exist, which is wild. But I'm going to go ahead and unsplash. Let's go ahead and select a photo. Oh, Philip, yes. Yes, you are absolutely right. So Philip is pointing out in the chat, you can change the color of the Lottie web on the Lottie website. Yes, so lottiefiles.com/editor. You can some Lottie animation. You can change the color as long as they were created with vector layers. Some of them include rasterized images and all sorts of weird masks and things like that. Those ones don't work as well, but you are absolutely right, Philip. lottiefiles.com/editor. All right, so in here we can go ahead and browse for some photos. And let's just say this dude over here is our artist, and there we go. Now, in some cases, what you might want to do, depending on the background color and depending on the profile photo, it may blend in a little bit. So you might want to maybe add a very subtle border, just so that there's a little bit of separation there, and that looks not too bad. All right. Next, while we have a few additional minutes, down here, we might want to start filling out some of the information for our albums, right? And because we're working with a repeat grid, it's very simple. So if I hop over to Finder, I do have some images that I might want to add in to this particular repeat grid, right? Now, one thing I could do is I could just drag one image and boop, pop it in there, drag another image and boop, pop it in there. But if you have all the images ready to go, you can actually drag all of them in at once. So if I go ahead and select And I will note that they drag in alphabetically. So in this case, they're all kind of in order right now. So if I select this one and this one and this one and this one, right? Boop, drag them all in, and there we go. Now we can still dive in here and make some changes to the actual scaling. So that's one thing you can override within a repeat grid. You can also override the actual text itself. So if I want to make sure, I want to change this to, let's say, back in time, right? And then the artist name was, I don't know, the Bananas. I can very easily do that. But when it comes to styling, that's a different story. That will push all the changes to the other cells. So because we're using the Forma typeface, right? I'm going to go back to Forma text, and you're noticing that pushed those changes everywhere else, which is great. There we go. And Forma. We'll sample this color here. And of course, as I'm designing it and building out this, my design system, I'll definitely want to go over to my document assets and start saving very, much of these elements. So the colors, definitely want to save this color. And then the character style, I'll probably want to select both of these and pop those into my character styles. I can also right click and then new group from selection. And this could be albums. And I can even dive in here. And this one is the larger one, so this will be album name. And then this one here is album artist. There we go. Just to keep things nice and orderly. All right. Make some changes to this as well. Now this I might be able to use the Forma DJR display typeface. I want to use the same color over here. And I maybe possibly bump this up in weight a little bit. I'm going to add this to my character styles. That way I can go down here and boop, pop that in there. Beautiful. I might also want maybe that over there and this over here. That looks pretty fancy. I'm also going to change the background of the actual artboard very subtly. I'm going to add a little bit of blue in here. Very subtle, right? Because I know that my sidebar is going to be a pure white. I want to make sure that the background is a little bit different so it doesn't blend too much, right? Something like that. And then eventually we're going to start designing out the play bar at the bottom. And this is kind of where you can really get kind of funky with your styling, but not too funky, because then it's going to be very difficult to see some of this. So if I go ahead and sample maybe this blue in the background, maybe I'll bring this down a touch so it's a little bit darker. But what we might want to do, we might explore this next week, is add a background blur. Now, of course, you don't want to add a background blur like this, because adding content on top of this is going to be nearly impossible, especially if you want like play buttons and sound bars and all sorts of different things, right? So you're going to want to blur this completely. So grab the blur amount and drag it all the way to 50. And then in terms of the brightness and the effect opacity, you might want to, because we're going for a lighter play bar, maybe bump up that brightness a little bit. But I think the most important thing is to grab the effect opacity and bring that up quite a bit, right? Something like 90. So it still introduces a little bit of blur back there, but very subtly. And that's exactly what you want. Sometimes you might be asking, is it even worth it? And it may not be, right? But sometimes that very subtle background blur can kind of, it just adds a nice little touch to your design, right? But once we start adding on that content on top of it, then we're really going to start to figure out if the background blur even makes sense. We may just, not even have the background blur at all, right? But we'll see how things are looking next week. I'm going to add a very subtle inner shadow to the top of this, but it's actually going to be more of like an inner highlight. The blur is at 0, Y at 1, and then maybe drop the opacity, just so there's a little bit of almost like a border at the top, right? I think that could work. And that's looking pretty good. And then before we wrap up, I'm going to pop a picture of me in here. Or at least a toy face of me. toy face, and boop. There we go. All right. It might be a bit too bold. It might also be a little bit too large too. But we'll work more on that next week. All right, my friends, that is going to wrap things up for me for today. A big thank you to everyone who has tuned in to Masterclass number 100. I will be back next week continuing this process. Definitely follow me on all the different platforms and stick around. Kyle T. Webster's coming up in just a few moments, and I will see you all next week. Thanks, everyone.